Everything you thought you knew about this case is about to be shattered, because what just happened in court doesn't just change the story. It rewrites the entire script of Hollywood itself, and the fallout is so devastating, so irreversible, that even the biggest stars cannot hide from the truth anymore. From the moment the courtroom doors swung open, it was clear this was not going to be an ordinary day because the atmosphere was so charged, so volatile, that even seasoned journalists whispered to each other that they had never seen anything quite like it. The cameras outside were flashing. The press was stacked shoulder to shoulder, the crowd of spectators buzzing with tension as though they knew they were about to witness history. And then as the lawyers marched in with stacks of papers and faces carved into stone, the murmurs rippled through the gallery like shockwaves, because the stakes had just escalated beyond recognition. This was no longer a fight about money, no longer a spat between celebrities. This had morphed into a cultural reckoning, a battle for credibility, truth, and survival. And in the middle of it all, the names Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Taylor Swift, Ryan Reynolds loomed like thunderclouds over a field. Already primed for lightning, the judge barely had to call for order before the first bombshell landed, and when it did, the entire courtroom gasped, because suddenly text messages that had been whispered about for months were not just rumors, they were confirmed, they were real, and they were coming into evidence, and you could practically hear the collective intake of breath as the realization hit everyone in the room that the walls of secrecy were crumbling faster than anyone could contain. Them, the lawyers knew it, the reporters knew it, and most painfully, the stars themselves knew it, because the very documents they had tried so desperately to keep hidden were now set to be exposed in brutal detail, stripping away every layer of PR, spin, and calculated denial. This was not just embarrassing, it was catastrophic, and you could see it written on the faces of those at the defense table. Every flicker of eye contact, every nervous shuffle of paper, every clenched jaw, a silent admission that the narrative was slipping away, and in its place, a storm of truth was roaring and unstoppable and unfiltered. And the public reaction outside mirrored the chaos inside, as fans who had worshipped these celebrities suddenly flooded social media with disbelief, anger, betrayal, and above all, hunger for more. Because when you dangle the possibility of private words being made public, when you promise receipts and proof the entire world stops to watch, and it did, stopping in its tracks as hashtags exploded across every platform, demanding answers, demanding transparency, demanding to know who had lied, who had manipulated, and who had betrayed whom. And what makes this even more surreal is the way Hollywood itself is reacting. Because insiders, who normally stay silent, are suddenly whispering to journalists that they always knew there were cracks, that they always suspected the alliances were fragile, that the friendships were performative. And now, with the mask ripped off, those whispers are becoming shouts, because the truth has validation, and nobody wants to be on the wrong side of history. The ripple effects are staggering. Contracts quietly being reconsidered, brand deals under review, studio executives pacing in glass towers, trying to decide if association is worth the risk. And all the while, the core drama inside that courtroom is unfolding like a movie script that even the best screenwriters could not have conjured. The judge hammering down objections, lawyers sparring, with venom witnesses glancing nervously toward the gallery, and every so often the flash of a camera reminding everyone that no matter how high the stakes in this courtroom, the court of public opinion is even higher and far more merciless, and it is in that court where reputations are tried, convicted, and destroyed in real time. The irony is staggering, because these are stars who built careers on image, on control, on crafting a perfect narrative for the public. Yet here they are stripped of that very control, forced to sit silently as their private words are dissected, their motives questioned, their alliances shredded. And while some will argue that this is just another celebrity scandal blown out of proportion, those who are watching closely know that this is something far darker, far more consequential, because what is really being tested here is not just who wins a case, but who walks away with their legacy intact. And as each revelation pours out like gasoline onto a fire, the legacy of some of the biggest names in Hollywood is being reduced to ashes, live for the world to see. The most fascinating part is how quickly allies turn to liabilities, because when pressure mounts, when exposure is inevitable, survival instincts kick in, and suddenly friends of years become silent, suddenly colleagues look the other way, suddenly the loyalty you thought was unshakable evaporates into self-preservation. And that is exactly what we are watching play out in real time, with every headline, every leaked quote, every carefully worded statement issued to the press. It is damage control in overdrive. But it is failing because no amount of PR can spin away the raw reality of evidence. And the moment those messages hit the public, Record the spin collapses entirely, leaving nothing but the unvarnished truth, and the unvarnished truth is brutal, relentless, and merciless, and it is here to stay. Blake Lively thought the storm had peaked after weeks of brutal headlines and devastating legal filings. But the reality was far darker than even her harshest critics predicted, because once the court made it clear that Justin Baldoni was not backing down and the evidence was not evaporating, the narrative surrounding her began to spin out of her control with such force that even her most carefully orchestrated public relations maneuvers collapsed under the weight of the revelations. And what made this moment even more catastrophic was the way Hollywood itself responded, because for years Lively and Ryan Reynolds had cultivated an image of untouchable charm, mixing glamour with sarcasm, power with relatability. Yet the illusion was crumbling, and every new leak, every whisper from the courtroom chipped away at the fairy tale she and Reynolds had sold to the public, as if the glass castle they built was finally cracking and the shards were slicing back at them with merciless precision. It was not simply a feud between Blake and Justin anymore, it had become a referendum on everything she represented. And when Taylor Swift's name was dragged into the filings, that fragile wall between personal loyalty and professional scandal exploded into a spectacle unlike anything the industry had seen in years, because Swift had long been Hollywood's barometer of authenticity, adored by fans, respected by peers, and feared by rivals. And the idea that private texts between her and Blake could surface shifted the entire narrative overnight. Suddenly, this was not just about an actress scrambling to preserve her career, this was about whether the Queen of Pop herself had been pulled unwillingly into the quicksand of deceit and manipulation. And that single detail became gasoline poured over an already raging fire, sending tabloids, influencers, and late-night hosts into a frenzy of speculation. What exactly did those texts contain? Were they merely friendly exchanges, twisted out of context? Or were they damning revelations about what Blake truly thought of Baldoni, of the industry, of her own friends? Because in Hollywood, perception is reality. And even the suggestion that Swift might be tied into Blake's legal implosion created a chilling effect, where allies turned silent and once reliable supporters began backing away with strategic distance. And Ryan Reynolds, who built his career on his uncanny ability to turn every scandal into a joke, suddenly found the humor drying up because the public was no longer laughing. The same fans who once adored his quick wit now saw cruelty where they once saw charm, and hypocrisy where they once saw rebellion against the Hollywood machine. And the whispers grew louder that perhaps Reynolds had known more than he let on. Perhaps his trademark sarcasm was not just banter but a shield for darker truths. And as this suspicion mounted Justin, Baldoni seemed almost untouched by the chaos, standing firm in his insistence that he had been maligned unfairly and that the evidence would vindicate him entirely. And this shift in perception was astonishing, because just months earlier, Baldoni was the underdog, a quiet presence behind the camera, dismissed by many as an idealist actor turned director. But the scandal catapulted him into a position of integrity, resilience, and almost reluctant heroism, where the public began to see him as a man willing to fight not just for his reputation but for fairness against a machine designed to crush anyone who did not conform to the powerful circles of Hollywood. And that framing terrified Blake's camp, because it meant this was no longer about her winning or losing. It was about her being positioned as the symbol of an outdated, manipulative culture that audiences were now eager to dismantle. And what made the spectacle even more venomous was the chorus of industry voices quietly cheering from the sidelines. Some former co-stars, some producers, some assistants, long silenced by contracts, or fear suddenly emboldened by the cracks in her armor, and they leaked whispers to the press, painting a portrait of a woman whose ambition often outpaced her loyalty, whose alliances shifted with convenience, and whose hunger for control left collateral damage in its wake. And though none of these whispers could be verified, the timing alone was enough to drown her in suspicion. Because in Hollywood, rumor carries as much weight as fact. And when the audience turns on you, no press statement, no teary interview, no contrived paparazzi photo can undo the damage. And still the question of the Taylor Swift texts loomed like a guillotine over every discussion, because if those messages confirmed even a fraction of the speculation, Blake's credibility would be incinerated in seconds, and the mere anticipation created a climate of dread for her team, who scrambled to file motions, block releases, and pressure media outlets. Yet every denial only fueled the sense that something damning lay beneath the surface. The media storm reached such a fever pitch that even celebrities who usually avoided controversy were forced to weigh in some subtly unfollowing Blake on Instagram, some liking Baldoni's posts, some dropping cryptic remarks in interviews, and each tiny action was dissected into headlines, magnified into confirmation of her collapse. And in this environment, Ryan Reynolds' own standing began to deteriorate because Hollywood loves a golden couple, but despises hypocrisy. And the notion that he too had played a role in shielding his wife or leveraging his own influence to spin narratives now seemed plausible. To a public that felt deceived after years of glossy magazine covers and carefully scripted late-night anecdotes. And while Blake attempted to play the victim card, framing herself as a woman under siege by a misogynistic industry, the optics refused to cooperate because this was not a lone crusader being bullied into silence. This was a powerful actress accused of weaponizing her influence and discarding those in her way. And the tide had shifted so completely that even experts began warning that her legal defeat was inevitable because the case had moved beyond law into the realm of cultural justice, where juries were not just jurors, but audiences who had already decided who deserved redemption and who deserved ruin, and every day. That past drew the noose tighter around Blake's image because the court of public opinion moves faster than any legal filing. And with Swift's shadow looming over the evidence pile, the suspense was unbearable. The question was not if Blake would fall, but how far and whether she would drag others down with her in her descent. And this fear became palpable when journalists began pressing Reynolds directly at events, his once unshakable confidence faltering as he sidestepped questions, his smirk more strained than charming. And gossip blogs noted how his usual swagger seemed to shrink under the weight of the scandal. His jokes landing flat, his timing off, as if the reality of consequences had finally punctured his armor. And this vulnerability only amplified the spectacle because audiences who once envied the couple's perfection now feasted on their collapse. And Justin Baldoni, the man they once overlooked, became the figure against whom they measured the hypocrisy of Hollywood, and with each passing day, he seemed less like a victim and more like a symbol of resistance against the very elitism Blake and Reynolds had come to embody. And this inversion of roles was devastating for Blake, because no matter what legal strategy her team deployed, no matter how many statements her publicists released, she could not erase the perception that her empire was crumbling and that the receipts were finally catching up to her. And in the end, perception is everything in Hollywood. And when that perception turns against you, it is not just a case you lose, it is a legacy you forfeit. And as the world waited for the next motion, the next leak, the next reveal, the suspense itself became the story, an unrelenting drumbeat of doom that made it impossible for Blake Lively to recover her footing. And for Justin Baldoni, it became a story of improbable vindication, as if the entire machinery of celebrity gossip, justice, and vengeance had aligned to prove that even the most carefully constructed image cannot withstand the exposure of inconvenient truth. The temperature inside Hollywood had already been boiling, but by the time this third wave of revelations hit, it felt like someone had ripped the lid off the pot and let it explode across the industry. Because now it wasn't just Blake Lively's courtroom maneuvers against Justin Baldoni that were under the microscope. It was the whole rotten architecture of how the game is played, being dragged into the light with each filing, each leaked text, each whispered account from insiders painting an uglier picture than the last. And if people thought this saga couldn't get any darker, they were wrong, because suddenly betrayals that had been carefully tucked away were now spilling into the open, and the headlines weren't just about legal strategy anymore. They were about moral collapse and the sense that everything audiences had been sold about loyalty, glamour, and friendship was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect egos and power structures that were now crumbling in real time. And at the center of this storm, Blake Lively's voice was increasingly drowned out by the sheer noise of contradictions. Because on the one hand, her legal team wanted to paint her as a victim of a ruthless smear campaign, while on the other hand, every document being unsealed seemed to suggest she had been pulling strings behind the scenes, making calls to publicists, feeding tidbits to media allies, and even pressuring people she once called friends into silence. And when Justin Baldoni's side dropped a fresh stack of evidence, the kind of material that wasn't just legal but cultural dynamite, people realized this wasn't simply a defamation case anymore. It was a referendum on Blake's entire persona. And suddenly, Ryan Reynolds, who had carefully tried to position himself as the charming husband cheering from the sidelines, found himself dragged deeper than ever into the muck, because his own emails, his own interactions were being referenced as possible threads in this web of manipulation. And you could feel the shift in the air as people who once would have gladly shielded Ryan were starting to distance themselves with small, quiet acts of avoidance and cold shoulders at industry events. And then there was the Taylor Swift angle hanging like a shadow that never left the conversation, because although Taylor had never testified publicly, the possibility that her texts, her private words, could be made public loomed like a sword over Blake's head. And if those messages contradicted even a fraction of Blake's courtroom claims, the backlash would be nuclear. And that's what made the gossip leak so devastating, because in the vacuum of certainty, the rumor mill began working overtime, churning out stories about phone calls where Taylor allegedly warned others to keep their distance, about old group chats where Ryan supposedly joked about controlling the narrative, and even about private dinners where Justin was allegedly told directly by sources close to Taylor that she had no intention of covering for Blake. And while no one could yet prove the full truth, every whisper, every headline, every according to insiders story added another crack in Blake's foundation, until the case felt less like her trying to hold Justin accountable and more like her desperately clawing to stop her own empire from collapsing. And then the courtroom itself became a theater of tension, because each time Blake's lawyers tried to shut down evidence on grounds of relevance, the judge seemed more skeptical, more inclined to let the material breathe into the record. And that's when observers started whispering that the worst-case scenario for Blake wasn't just losing the case, it was discovery dragging her entire private world into the open, because discovery meant subpoenas. Discovery meant deposing journalists, influencers, even fellow actors. And suddenly there were names floating in the ether. Names of content creators who had once cheered Blake but were now on her radar as possible liabilities. And the very idea of celebrities trying to silence or intimidate online voices made the public furious, because it smelled of censorship and desperation. And then came the leak that one of Blake's closest allies in Hollywood, a figure whose loyalty she had always bragged about, had privately admitted to reporters that the whole affair wasn't that bad, in reference to the original allegations against Justin, which landed like a grenade. Because if her own confidants were admitting this off the record, then how could her courtroom narrative survive intact? And sure enough, social media lit up with hashtags that twisted Blake's own words into memes, people mocking the contradictions, pulling receipts of her past interviews about honesty and authenticity, and comparing them to the way her legal strategy seemed to contradict every value she claimed to embody. And meanwhile, Justin was playing the long game, staying measured, calm, issuing carefully worded statements about accountability and truth. And every time he kept his composure while Blake lashed out, it reinforced the image of him as the one being wronged, and her as the one flailing, in panic. And then came the whispers that Ryan Reynolds himself might be weighing his own legal strategy, because if evidence tied him too closely to Blake's actions, his reputation, his business deals, his brand could take catastrophic hits. And you could practically hear the whispers in Hollywood boardrooms as executives started asking the unthinkable questions about whether Ryan was still bankable, whether projects in development could move forward without risk. And layered on top of that was the eerie silence from Taylor Swift, who neither condemned nor defended Blake, but whose absence spoke louder than any statement. Because people noticed that when Taylor is truly loyal to someone, she shows up, she shields them, she takes risks for them. And the fact that she was absent here made it crystal clear that Blake could no longer rely on her for cover. And that realization alone was devastating, because Blake's entire Hollywood image had been built on the idea of being inside the right circles, close to the right power players. But now, as the walls closed in, those same circles seemed to shrink away, leaving her isolated at the very moment she needed allies most. And the darker truth emerging was that Hollywood wasn't just angry with Blake, they were scared of what else might be revealed if she kept fighting. Because this case was dragging everyone into the mud. And the fear wasn't just about reputations, it was about exposure, about the way private conversations could suddenly become courtroom evidence. And as Blake doubled down, refusing to back off, the whispers grew louder that she was willing to burn bridges, scorch earth, and take others down with her, if that's what it took to survive. And in that moment, you could feel the divide opening wide between her and Ryan. Because while Blake seemed determined to fight to the bitter end, Ryan was a pragmatist, and pragmatists in Hollywood don't go down with the ship, they cut losses, they pivot. They protect their image at all costs. And that tension between husband and wife became another layer of speculation in tabloids, another layer of commentary in podcasts, another thread of doubt pulling at the narrative, until suddenly this wasn't just a courtroom fight. It was a Hollywood psychodrama with stakes that felt biblical: betrayal, loyalty, silence, exposure, and the creeping realization that someone in this story was going to walk away, destroyed, and someone else vindicated. But the question no one could yet answer was whether Blake realized she had already crossed the point of no return, because every attempt to control the fire seemed only to make the blaze larger, and now it wasn't a matter of whether the dam would break, but how violently it would collapse when it finally did, and who would be washed away with it. Blake Lively's empire now stands on the edge of collapse, and what began as a carefully calculated lawsuit meant to silence Justin Baldoni has spiraled into a wildfire that she cannot contain. The courtroom drama, the leaks, the betrayals, and the horror whisper campaigns have not only destroyed her credibility, but also pulled Ryan Reynolds into the line of fire, while Hollywood watches with cold fascination as the golden couple struggles to maintain their grip on power. Justin, on the other hand, has emerged from the chaos stronger than ever. No longer seen as a victim, but as a survivor, who exposed the very corruption that others were too afraid to name, and now the media has shifted the narrative, painting him as a man who refused to bow. While the court of public opinion annihilates Blake, every word, every text, and every recording has chipped away at her reputation until even allies are quietly distancing themselves. Taylor Swift's shadow looms in the background, her silence speaking, louder than words, fueling speculation that she knows far more than she is willing to admit. And if those rumored texts are released, the final nail may be hammered into Blake's carefully constructed image. The public backlash is no longer about one lawsuit. It has become a symbol of what happens when power, privilege, and arrogance collide with truth and persistence, and the entire industry is learning that even the most untouchable names can fall. Now Blake faces not only legal defeat, but cultural exile, and her every move is scrutinized with merciless precision. Hollywood will remember this moment not as another celebrity feud, but as a turning point where the mask slipped and the truth was laid bare, and as the dust settles, reality is undeniable. Blake Lively is finished.